I stood in the grand foyer of Riverside Manor, my termination letter crumpled in my trembling fist, watching as paramedics wheeled Bob Mitchell out on a stretcher. His daughter Victoria stood beside me, her perfectly manicured hand resting on my shoulder in what anyone else would mistake for comfort. But I could feel the satisfied smirk hiding behind her concerned expression as she whispered, "Don't worry, Emma. We'll make sure everyone knows exactly what happened here tonight." That's when it hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. The medication mix-up, the missing will, the mysterious phone calls, Bob's sudden paranoia about me stealing from him. None of it was coincidence. For 6 months, I'd been living in a carefully constructed trap, and tonight was supposed to be my complete destruction. But here's what Victoria Mitchell didn't know. I'd been recording everything. This is the story of how I went from trusted caretaker to accused criminal, and how I discovered that sometimes the people planning your downfall forget that the help sees everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Emma Rodriguez, and for 3 years I believed I was the luckiest caretaker in all of Connecticut. When I answered the job posting for a live-in caregiver at Riverside Manor in Millbrook, I thought I'd won the lottery. The pay was exceptional, the estate was breathtaking, and Bob Mitchell seemed like the grandfather I'd never had. Bob was 78 years old then, recently widowed, and dealing with the early stages of what his doctors called mild cognitive decline. Nothing serious, they assured me, just some forgetfulness and occasional confusion that came with age. His late wife, Catherine, had been the love of his life for 52 years, and losing her had left him adrift in a house that suddenly felt too big and too quiet. The Mitchell family had built their fortune in textiles over 3 generations, and Riverside Manor was the crown jewel of their empire. 15 acres of manicured lawns, formal gardens, and century-old oak trees surrounded the main house, which Bob's grandfather had built in 1923. The property was worth $8 million, though Bob always said it was priceless, because every brick held memories of his family's American dream. When I started working there, Bob was still sharp as a tack about most things. He could recite textile market trends from the 1960s, remember every employee who'd ever worked for Mitchell Textiles, and beat me at chess 4 games out of 5. His only daughter, Victoria, lived in Manhattan, running the day-to-day operations of the family business from their corporate headquarters. She visited maybe once a month, usually just long enough to review financial statements and remind Bob that he should consider moving to a nice assisted living facility. Bob's daily routine was comfortable and predictable. Mornings started with coffee in the sunroom while reading 3 different newspapers cover to cover. He'd spend afternoons in his study, managing his investments or writing in his leather-bound journal. Evenings meant classical music in the library, usually Bach or Mozart, while he worked on 1,000-piece puzzles that covered every surface of the mahogany table his great-grandfather had imported from England. My job was to make sure he took his medications on time, help him remember appointments, drive him to doctor visits, and most importantly, provide companionship. Bob wasn't looking for a nurse. He wanted someone to talk to, someone who'd listen to his stories about building the business from nothing, about Catherine's garden parties that were legendary in Millbrook society, about his pride in Victoria's MBA from Wharton, and her success in modernizing Mitchell Textiles. The estate employed a small but dedicated staff. Maria, the housekeeper, had been with the family for 15 years and treated Bob like her own father. Tony, the groundskeeper, maintained the gardens with the precision of an artist, and Mrs. Patterson, the cook, prepared meals that could have graced any 5-star restaurant. I lived in the converted carriage house, a charming 2-bedroom cottage that Bob had renovated specifically for his caregiver. It had everything I could want: a full kitchen, a cozy living room with a fireplace, and windows that looked out over Catherine's rose garden. For 3 years, life at Riverside Manor felt like something out of a fairy tale. Bob treated me more like family than an employee. He insisted I join him for dinner most evenings, encouraged me to use the library whenever I wanted, and even gave me access to the estate's vintage Mercedes for personal errands. When my sister Maria graduated nursing school, Bob not only attended her ceremony but also offered her a job at the local hospital where he served on the board of directors. Bob's health was stable during those first years, managed easily with a simple routine of medications for blood pressure, cholesterol, and the mild cognitive symptoms. Dr. Helen Chen, his longtime physician, monitored his condition closely and always said he was doing remarkably well for his age. His memory might slip occasionally, forgetting where he'd put his reading glasses or repeating a story he'd told the day before, but nothing that interfered with his independence or quality of life. Victoria seemed pleased with the arrangement during her monthly visits. She'd review his medical reports, check the household accounts, and spend an hour or two catching up with her father before returning to Manhattan. She was always polite to me, professional but distant, which I understood. I was the help, after all, and she was a successful businesswoman with important responsibilities. The estate ran like clockwork, and I genuinely loved my job. Bob was kind, intelligent, and grateful for everything I did. He'd often tell me that I'd given him his life back after Catherine's death, that having someone around who cared about his well-being made the big house feel like home again. Some evenings, after a particularly good day, he'd pat my hand and say, "Emma, I don't know what I'd do without you. You're the daughter I always wished Victoria could be." I should have realized that comments like that would eventually reach the wrong ears. The first signs that something was changing came about 8 months ago, though I didn't recognize them as warning signs at the time. Victoria started visiting more frequently, sometimes twice a month instead of her usual schedule. She'd bring a briefcase full of documents for Bob to review and sign, explaining that the business was expanding into new markets and required his approval for various contracts and investments. Bob seemed pleased by her increased attention at first. "Victoria's finally showing real interest in preserving the family legacy," he told me after one of her visits. "She's asking about the estate, about my plans for the future. I think losing Catherine made her realize that time is precious." Around the same time, Jim Patterson started making regular appearances at the manor. Jim was Bob's business partner and the lawyer who'd handled Mitchell family affairs for over 20 years. He was a handsome man in his early 40s, always impeccably dressed, with the kind of confident smile that made you want to trust him immediately. Bob had mentioned that Jim was like a son to him. The boy had started as an intern at Mitchell Textiles right out of law school and had worked his way up to becoming Bob's most trusted advisor. Jim's visits weren't unusual in themselves, but their frequency increased dramatically. Where he used to come by maybe once every few months to discuss business matters, suddenly he was appearing every week, sometimes twice a week. He'd spend hours in Bob's study with the door closed, their voices rising and falling in what sounded like intense discussions. When I'd bring them coffee or lunch, they'd stop talking immediately, waiting until I left before resuming their conversation. Jim was always polite to me, charming even, but I noticed he had a habit of watching me work, studying my routines, asking casual questions about Bob's daily schedule and medication regimen. Bob's demeanor began to shift subtly during this period. He became more forgetful, not just about small things but about conversations we'd had the day before. His sleep patterns changed. He'd wander the house at night, and I'd often find him in the morning sitting in his study, staring at papers he couldn't remember reviewing. Dr. Chen adjusted his medications twice during this time, saying that cognitive decline could be unpredictable and that we needed to stay vigilant about his symptoms. The most troubling change was Bob's growing paranoia about money. He'd always been careful with his finances, but suddenly he was obsessing over every household expense, questioning bills he'd paid automatically for years, and expressing concern that people were taking advantage of him. One morning, I found him trying to balance his checkbook at 4 a.m., muttering about missing funds and unauthorized transactions. "Emma," he said when he saw me in the doorway, "I think someone's been stealing from me. The numbers don't add up anymore." I helped him back to bed and made a note to mention his concerns to Dr. Chen. But when I called her office, I was told that Jim Patterson had already spoken with her about Bob's paranoid episodes, and that she'd be adjusting his medications again to help with the anxiety. Victoria's attitude toward me began to change during this period as well. Where she'd always been polite but distant, now she was watching me with barely concealed suspicion. She started asking pointed questions about my access to Bob's personal documents, about the household accounts I helped manage, about my own financial situation. When I mentioned that I was saving money to eventually buy my own small house, she raised an eyebrow and said, "That's quite ambitious on a caregiver's salary. You must be very good at budgeting." The comment felt like an accusation, though I couldn't understand why. I'd never taken anything that wasn't freely given, never overstepped the boundaries of my position, never done anything but care for Bob with complete dedication. But Victoria's suspicious glances and Jim's constant presence made me feel like I was being evaluated for some test I didn't know I was taking. Looking back now, I realize that 8 months ago was when the trap began to close around me. Every conversation, every document, every change in Bob's routine was carefully orchestrated to create a narrative that would destroy my reputation and remove me from Bob's life permanently. They were building a case against me, piece by piece, and I was too naive to see it happening. The most insidious part was how natural it all seemed. Victoria's increased concern for her father's well-being, Jim's diligent attention to business matters, Bob's gradual decline. All of it could be explained by normal family dynamics and the inevitable progression of age. I trusted these people because Bob trusted them. And Bob had taught me that family loyalty was sacred, that the people who love you most are the ones who'll fight hardest to protect you. I had no idea that sometimes the people who claim to love you most are the ones planning your destruction with the greatest care and precision. I was about to learn that lesson in the most brutal way possible. But I was also about to discover that being underestimated can be the greatest advantage of all. The stage was set, the players were in position, and I was walking blindly toward the moment when everything I believed about trust, loyalty, and family would shatter like glass. But in that wreckage, I would find something unexpected, the strength to fight back and the evidence to prove that sometimes the victim knows more than the perpetrators realize. The first real crack in my perfect world appeared on a cold Tuesday morning in March, when I walked into Bob's study and found him hunched over his desk, frantically shuffling through papers with tears streaming down his face. He looked up at me with eyes I'd never seen before. Wild, frightened, completely lost. "They're gone, Emma," he whispered, his voice breaking. "The documents Catherine left me, the ones about the family trust. Someone took them right out of my safe." I rushed to his side, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. The safe stood open behind his desk, and I could see it was nearly empty, except for a few scattered photographs and an old pocket watch. Bob had shown me those documents before, thick legal papers that Catherine had insisted he keep secure, something about protecting the estate from business creditors and ensuring it would remain in the family forever. "Maybe you moved them somewhere else for safekeeping," I suggested, though even as I said it, I knew Bob was too methodical to forget something so important. He kept everything in its proper place, a habit ingrained by decades of running a successful business. Bob shook his head violently. No. They were right here, in the fireproof box Catherine bought. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "She made me promise to keep them safe, Emma. She said they were the only thing standing between our family and people who might try to take everything we'd built." I helped him search the study from top to bottom, checking every drawer, every shelf, every possible hiding place. The documents were nowhere to be found. When I suggested we call the police to report a burglary, Bob's face went pale. "We can't," he said quickly, glancing toward the door as if someone might be listening. "Victoria said the police wouldn't understand, that it would just make me look confused and paranoid. She said if I really lost important papers, it might be evidence that I'm not capable of managing my own affairs anymore." The comment sent a chill down my spine. When had Victoria said that to him? I'd been present for all her recent visits, and I'd never heard her mention anything about police or Bob's mental capacity. But Bob seemed so certain, so frightened by the possibility that I didn't press the issue. That afternoon, Jim Patterson arrived for another of his increasingly frequent visits. I was in the kitchen preparing Bob's afternoon medications when I heard raised voices coming from the study. Curious and concerned, I moved closer to the door, pretending to dust the antique table in the hallway. "You have to trust me on this, Bob," Jim was saying, his voice carrying that smooth, persuasive tone he used when discussing business matters. "The missing documents are a serious problem, but I can recreate everything from the copies in my office. The important thing is that we protect your assets before anyone realizes there might be gaps in your estate planning. But Catherine specifically said never to let anyone else handle those papers," Bob replied, sounding confused and distressed. She said the trust was structured in a very particular way to protect Emma and the staff if anything happened to me. There was a long pause, and when Jim spoke again, his voice was harder, less patient. Bob, with all due respect, Catherine's been gone for 4 years. Things change, tax laws change, your situation has changed. Emma's a wonderful caregiver, but you can't let sentimentality interfere with sound financial planning. I froze at the mention of my name. Why were they discussing me in the context of Bob's estate planning? I'd never asked about his will, never assumed I'd be included in his final arrangements beyond perhaps a small token of appreciation for my years of service. I'm not being sentimental, Bob said, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. Catherine was very clear about her wishes. She wanted to make sure the people who truly cared for me would be taken care of. And they will be, Jim assured him. But first we need to make sure there are no legal vulnerabilities that someone could exploit. I've seen cases where caregivers manipulate elderly clients into changing their wills, claiming they deserve large inheritances for providing basic services. We need to protect you from that kind of manipulation. The words hit me like a physical blow. Jim was talking about me, suggesting that I might be manipulating Bob for financial gain. The accusation was so far from the truth, it was almost laughable. Except that Bob was clearly listening and considering Jim's words seriously. Emma would never do that, Bob said, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice that hadn't been there before. She's been nothing but loyal and kind. I'm sure she seems that way, Jim replied smoothly. But Bob, you have to understand that people can be very good at hiding their true intentions. Professional caregivers are trained to build emotional bonds with their clients. It's part of what makes them effective, but it can also make elderly people vulnerable to influence. I backed away from the door before I could hear Bob's response, my heart pounding with a mixture of anger and fear. Jim Patterson was poisoning Bob's mind against me, making him question 3 years of genuine care and affection. But why? What did Jim have to gain by turning Bob against me? The answer came to me with sickening clarity. If Bob began to doubt my motives, if he started believing I was only being kind to him for money, he might change his will to remove any provisions Catherine had made for my future security. And if those provisions were substantial, someone else would benefit significantly from their removal. Over the following days, I noticed subtle changes in Bob's behavior toward me. He still smiled when I brought his coffee, still enjoyed our evening conversations, but there was a new wariness in his eyes. He started asking me strange questions about my family's financial situation, about my plans for the future, about whether I'd ever thought about what might happen to me when he was gone. I worry about you, Emma, he said one evening as we sat in the library after dinner. You've devoted so much time to taking care of me, but what about your own life? Don't you want to get married, have children, build something for yourself? The questions seemed innocent enough, but they felt loaded with implications I couldn't quite grasp. I'm happy here, Bob, I told him honestly. Taking care of you doesn't feel like a sacrifice. It feels like family. Bob's expression shifted at the word family, a flicker of something. Guilt? Fear? Passing across his features. Family, he repeated softly. Yes, that's what Catherine always said you were. Family. That night, I lay awake in my cottage wondering what Catherine had really said about me, what provisions she might have insisted on, including in Bob's will. I'd always assumed that Bob's kindness toward me was simply his natural generosity. But what if there was more to it? What if Catherine had seen something in our relationship that I'd missed? Some deeper connection that she'd wanted to protect through legal documentation. The next morning brought a new development that would push my growing concerns into the realm of genuine alarm. Victoria arrived unannounced, pulling up to the manor in a black BMW I'd never seen before. She wasn't alone. A woman in a crisp business suit emerged from the passenger seat, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the kind of serious expression that suggested official business. Emma? Victoria called as I met them at the front door. This is Dr. Sandra Walsh from the Connecticut Department of Elder Services. She's here to conduct a routine evaluation of my father's living situation. Dr. Walsh stepped forward with a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. Ms. Rodriguez, I hope you don't mind if I ask you a few questions about Mr. Mitchell's care routine. It's just standard procedure when we receive reports about potential concerns. Reports? My stomach dropped. What kind of concerns? Victoria answered before Dr. Walsh could speak. Nothing serious. Just questions about whether Dad's current arrangement is still the best option for his needs. As his condition progresses, we want to make sure he's getting appropriate care. But Bob's condition hadn't progressed significantly. His memory was perhaps a bit more scattered than it had been a year ago. But he was still functional, still capable of making his own decisions about most things. The suggestion that his living situation needed evaluation felt premature and invasive. Dr. Walsh spent the next 2 hours interviewing Bob privately, then observing our interactions during his afternoon routine. She asked probing questions about his medications, his daily activities, his social interactions, and most pointedly, about his relationship with me. Mr. Mitchell seems very attached to you, she observed as we watched Bob working in Catherine's garden. How do you maintain appropriate professional boundaries in a live-in care situation? The question felt like a trap. Bob and I have a very respectful relationship, I said carefully. I provide care and companionship, and he treats me with kindness and appreciation. I've never crossed any professional lines. Dr. Walsh made notes in her file without comment, but I could see Victoria watching me intently, as if my response was being scored for some test I didn't understand I was taking. After Dr. Walsh left, Bob seemed agitated and confused. Why did she keep asking about you, Emma? About whether you help me with my financial decisions. About whether you've ever suggested changes to my will. I told her you've never even mentioned those things, but she kept pressing. My blood ran cold. The evaluation hadn't been about Bob's care needs at all. It had been about me. About my role in his life, about whether I was somehow manipulating or taking advantage of him. Someone had planted doubts about my intentions, and now those doubts were being investigated by official agencies. Bob, I said gently, has anyone suggested to you that I might be taking advantage of you in some way? Bob's face crumpled with guilt and confusion. Jim said I should be careful about getting too close to people who depend on me for their livelihood. He said sometimes caregivers develop feelings for their clients that aren't healthy, that they might start thinking of themselves as family when they're really just employees. The words cut deep because they twisted something beautiful into something ugly. My care for Bob wasn't professional calculation. It was genuine affection built over 3 years of shared conversations, quiet companionship, and mutual respect. But I could see how someone with ulterior motives could make it look suspicious, could use Bob's gratitude and my dedication as evidence of something inappropriate. That evening, I called my sister Maria for advice. As a nurse, she understood the complexities of caregiver relationships and the potential for misunderstanding. Emma, she said after I explained the situation, you need to be very careful. I've seen cases where families turn against caregivers when money's involved. If Bob's will includes provisions for you, and if someone else wants those provisions removed, they'll try to make you look like a manipulator or a gold digger. But I don't even know what's in his will, I protested. I've never asked. Never even thought about it. That doesn't matter, Maria replied grimly. What matters is what other people can make it look like. You need to start protecting yourself, Emma. Document everything. Your conversations, your duties, any accusations or suggestions that you're doing something wrong. And for God's sake, don't sign anything or agree to any changes in your employment without getting legal advice first. Her words proved prophetic. The next week, Jim Patterson arrived with a new employment contract for me to sign. The document was thick with legal language I didn't understand, but the basic message was clear. I would continue as Bob's caregiver under new terms that limited my access to certain areas of the house, restricted my involvement in any financial or legal matters, and included language about appropriate professional boundaries and, quote, conflict of interest policies. It's just to protect everyone, Jim explained with his trademark smile. Bob's insurance company requires updated caregiver agreements for liability purposes. Nothing changes in your day-to-day routine. But everything was changing, and I could feel the walls closing in around me. The people I'd trusted were systematically isolating me, questioning my motives, and building a case for my removal from Bob's life. I just didn't understand why or how far they were willing to go to achieve their goals. I was about to find out that their plan was far more elaborate and dangerous than I could have imagined. The new employment contract sat on my kitchen table for 3 days while I wrestled with whether to sign it. Something deep in my gut told me that putting my name on that document would be like stepping into quicksand, but refusing to sign might give Victoria and Jim the excuse they seemed to be looking for to have me removed immediately. During those 3 days, I tried to maintain the normal rhythm of life at Riverside Manor, but everything felt different now. Bob's morning coffee routine, which had always been our peaceful time to discuss the day ahead, was now filled with his anxious questions about whether I was happy with my job, whether I felt I was being treated fairly, whether I might be thinking about leaving. "You know, Emma," he said on Thursday morning as I arranged his medications and the weekly pill dispenser, "Jim thinks I should give you a raise. He says good caregivers are hard to find, and I should make sure you feel appreciated." The offer should have made me happy, but instead it filled me with dread. Why was Jim suddenly concerned about my compensation? In 3 years, he'd barely acknowledged my existence beyond polite greetings, and now he was advocating for better pay. It felt like another piece of a puzzle I couldn't quite see clearly. "I appreciate the thought, Bob, but my salary is already very generous," I replied carefully. "I don't need a raise." Bob looked surprised by my response. "But Jim said you'd been asking about your future security, about what would happen to you if my health declined further. He said it was natural for you to be concerned about your financial stability." I stopped counting pills and looked directly at Bob. I never said any of those things to Jim. When would I have even had the opportunity? He only speaks to me to exchange pleasantries. Confusion clouded Bob's features. "But he said, he was very specific about a conversation you'd had about your concerns. He even mentioned that you'd ask about being included in my estate planning." The lie was so blatant, so easily disproven, that for a moment I couldn't find words. Jim was fabricating conversations that had never happened, putting words in my mouth that I'd never spoken, and somehow Bob was believing him over me. "Bob," I said gently, sitting down across from him at the breakfast table, "I need you to think very carefully. Have I ever mentioned your will to you? Have I ever asked about inheritance, or what might happen to me after you're gone? Have I ever discussed my financial concerns with Jim Patterson?" Bob stared at me for a long moment, his forehead creased with the effort of trying to remember. I thought you had." Jim was so certain. "He had details about what you'd said." "What kind of details?" "He said you'd told him you were worried about finding another position at your age if something happened to me. He said you'd mentioned that you'd grown attached to the estate and hoped you might be able to stay connected to it somehow. He said you'd asked whether Catherine had made any provisions for longtime staff members in her instructions to me." Every word was a fabrication, but they were clever fabrications. They sounded like things a caring, long-term employee might reasonably worry about or ask about. Jim was building a narrative that painted me as concerned about my future security without making me sound greedy or manipulative. Yet, "Bob, I promise you, I never had any such conversation with Jim. I think someone is trying to make it seem like I'm more interested in your money than I actually am." Bob's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee cup. "But why would Jim lie about something like that? He's been like family to me for 20 years. He has no reason to hurt you or me." That was the question that kept me awake at night. What did Jim Patterson have to gain by destroying my relationship with Bob? The answer, I was beginning to suspect, lay in whatever provisions Catherine had made for my future, and in whatever plans Victoria and Jim had for Bob's estate that didn't include honoring those provisions. The routine of caring for Bob continued, but it felt like performing a play where someone kept changing the script without telling me. Meals that had once been relaxed conversations became tense affairs where Bob watched me carefully, as if trying to detect signs of the financial scheming that Jim claimed to have discussed with me. Our evening reading sessions in the library were interrupted by Bob's sudden questions about my family, my expenses, my hopes for the future. Most disturbing was the way Bob began to pull back from the physical affection that had always been natural between us. He stopped patting my hand when I brought his evening tea, stopped giving me the fatherly hugs that had made me feel like I truly belonged at Riverside Manor. When I asked if I'd done something to upset him, he assured me that everything was fine, but his eyes didn't meet mine. Victoria's visits became more frequent and more intensive. She would arrive with folders full of documents for Bob to review, spending hours in his study going over business matters that seemed to exhaust and confuse him. When she emerged from these sessions, Bob was always agitated, talking about decisions he needed to make and changes that might be necessary. "Victoria's been helping me understand some complicated financial matters," Bob told me after one particularly long meeting. "Apparently there are tax implications to some of the arrangements Catherine made that I didn't understand. Victoria says we might need to make some modifications to simplify things." I wanted to ask what kind of modifications, but the new wariness in Bob's manner made me hesitant to show too much interest in his financial affairs. Jim's fictional conversations had made any curiosity about Bob's business seem potentially suspicious. The breaking point came on a rainy Friday afternoon when I returned from grocery shopping to find Dr. Chen's car in the driveway. Bob's regular appointments were on Mondays, and emergency visits were extremely rare given his stable condition. I hurried inside to find Bob sitting in the living room looking pale and shaken, while Dr. Chen packed up her medical bag with an expression I'd never seen before. Professional concern mixed with something that looked like disappointment. "Emma," Dr. Chen said when she saw me, "we need to talk." My heart began to race. "Is Bob all right? What's happened?" "Mr. Mitchell is fine physically," Dr. Chen replied, but her tone suggested that wasn't the whole story. "However, I've received some concerning reports about irregularities in his medication routine. There have been suggestions that he's been confused about his prescriptions, possibly taking incorrect dosages." I stared at her in shock. "That's impossible. I manage his medications exactly as you've prescribed them. I have a detailed chart, and I check it twice before giving him anything." Dr. Chen pulled a notebook from her bag and flipped through several pages. "According to the reports I've received, Mr. Mitchell has been found with pills scattered around his room on multiple occasions. There have also been instances where he's complained of side effects consistent with either missing doses or double doses of his medications." "Who reported this?" I demanded, though I was already beginning to suspect the answer. "I'm not at liberty to discuss the source of the reports, but they came from family members who were concerned about Mr. Mitchell's safety and your ability to manage his complex medical needs." Bob was sitting quietly during this exchange, looking confused and frightened. When I turned to him for confirmation that his medications had been managed properly, he just stared at his hands. "Bob," I said gently, "you know I've never made mistakes with your pills. You know I'm careful about following Dr. Chen's instructions exactly." Bob looked up at me with eyes full of uncertainty. I found pills on my nightstand yesterday morning. I couldn't remember if I'd taken them or if you'd left them there. And last week, I felt very dizzy after taking my evening medications, like maybe I'd taken too much." My world tilted sideways. Either Bob was genuinely confused about what had happened, or someone was gaslighting him into believing I was incompetent or dangerous. Neither possibility offered any comfort. Dr. Chen continued, "I'm going to need to modify Mr. Mitchell's care plan. From now on, all medications will need to be administered by a licensed medical professional. I'm recommending that the family hire a registered nurse to handle all medical care, with you continuing to provide companionship and household support." The demotion was devastating, not just professionally but personally. Medication management had been one of the key responsibilities that made me feel truly useful to Bob, and it required a level of trust and communication that had strengthened our relationship. Removing that responsibility sent a clear message that I was no longer trusted with Bob's most basic needs. "Dr. Chen," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I've never made an error with Mr. Mitchell's medications. Never. I think someone is trying to make it appear that I'm incompetent or negligent." Dr. Chen's expression softened slightly. "Emma, I've always considered you to be an excellent caregiver. But when family members express concerns about a patient's safety, I have to take those concerns seriously. This modification is about protecting everyone. Mr. Mitchell, you, and the family." After Dr. Chen left, Bob retreated to his study and closed the door. I spent the afternoon in my cottage, staring out at Catherine's rose garden and trying to understand how my careful, loving care of Bob was being twisted into evidence of incompetence or worse. That evening, Victoria arrived with a woman I'd never seen before, a stern-faced registered nurse named Patricia Williams, who would be taking over Bob's medical care starting immediately. Patricia was efficient and professional, but she treated me with cool disdain, as if I were a problem that needed to be managed, rather than a colleague who'd been caring for Bob successfully for 3 years. "I'll need you to show me where you've been keeping Mr. Mitchell's medications," Patricia said, pulling on latex gloves as if my handling of Bob's pills had contaminated them somehow. I led her to the kitchen, where Bob's weekly pill organizer sat on the counter next to a detailed chart I maintained of his dosing schedule, side effects to watch for, and emergency contacts. Patricia examined everything with the thoroughness of a crime scene investigator, taking photographs and making notes in a professional-looking binder. "Has Mr. Mitchell ever complained about feeling confused or unwell after taking his medications?" she asked. "Never," I replied honestly. "He's always tolerated everything well. If he'd ever felt dizzy or confused, he would have told me immediately, and I would have called Dr. Chen." Patricia made another note. "And you're certain you've never made any errors in dosage or timing?" "I'm absolutely certain. I double-check everything against the prescription bottles and the chart. I've never given him anything Dr. Chen didn't prescribe." But even as I said the words, I realized how impossible it would be to prove my innocence if someone was deliberately sabotaging Bob's medications. If pills were being added to or removed from his organizer when I wasn't around, if someone was giving him extra doses and then blaming the resulting confusion on my incompetence, I would have no way to defend myself. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the old house settling around me, I understood that I was fighting a battle I couldn't win with the weapons I had. Someone with access to Bob, someone he trusted completely, was systematically destroying my credibility and my relationship with the man I'd come to love like family. I needed to find out who was behind this campaign against me, and I needed to find proof of what they were doing before they succeeded in destroying everything I'd built at Riverside Manor. But I was beginning to realize that Victoria and Jim's plan was far more sophisticated than simple character assassination. They weren't just trying to get rid of me. They were building a case that would justify taking control of Bob's life completely, and I was the obstacle they needed to remove before they could implement whatever they had planned for his future. The new nursing arrangement with Patricia Williams created an atmosphere of constant surveillance that made every aspect of caring for Bob feel like a performance under scrutiny. Patricia arrived each morning at 7 sharp, reviewed Bob's condition with the thoroughness of a military inspection, and made detailed notes about every interaction she observed between Bob and me. What made the situation particularly unsettling was how Patricia seemed to be conducting her own investigation into my character and competence. She asked Bob leading questions about his comfort level with me, about whether he'd ever felt pressured to agree to anything he didn't want to do, about whether he'd noticed any of his personal belongings going missing. "Mr. Mitchell," I heard her say during one of Bob's medication reviews, "it's important that you feel completely safe and comfortable with everyone who has access to your home. Has anyone ever made you feel obligated to do things you weren't sure about?" Bob's response was always confused and hesitant. No, I don't think so. Emma's always been very respectful of my wishes." "That's good," Patricia would reply in a tone that somehow made Bob's answer sound insufficient. "But sometimes people can be very subtle in how they influence others, especially when there might be personal gain involved. You'd tell Dr. Chen or your family if you ever felt uncomfortable, wouldn't you?" These conversations were having their intended effect. Bob began questioning things he'd never questioned before, analyzing normal interactions for hidden meanings that didn't exist. When I helped him choose clothes for the day, he would ask if I had any preference about what he wore. When I prepared his favorite meals, he would wonder aloud if I was trying to make him happy for some ulterior motive. The most painful change was in our evening routine. For 3 years, Bob and I had ended each day with tea in the library, talking about books, sharing stories, or simply enjoying comfortable silence together. Now these sessions were filled with Bob's anxious questions about my motivations and intentions. "Emma," he said one evening as we sat surrounded by his collection of first edition classics, "Jim asked me something today that I can't stop thinking about. He wanted to know if you'd ever mentioned feeling like you'd sacrificed your own life to take care of me." I set down my teacup carefully, trying to hide how much the question stung. "What did you tell him?" "I said you'd never complained about anything, that you always seemed happy here." But then he said that sometimes people who feel trapped or resentful don't express it directly. He said they might show their feelings in other ways, like becoming possessive or acting like they deserve special treatment. Every word felt like a carefully placed needle designed to make Bob doubt the authenticity of our relationship. Bob, do you think I've ever acted possessive toward you or demanded special treatment? Bob studied my face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. No, but Jim said I might not recognize it because I care about you too much to see your faults clearly. He said elderly people sometimes develop blind spots about the people who take care of them. The manipulation was masterful in its subtlety. Jim wasn't directly accusing me of wrongdoing. He was planting seeds of doubt about Bob's ability to judge my character accurately. Every positive feeling Bob had toward me was being reframed as potential evidence of impaired judgment rather than genuine affection earned through years of devoted care. Victoria's questions were even more pointed. During her increasingly frequent visits, she would pull Bob aside for private conversations that left him agitated and confused. When I asked if everything was all right, Bob would just say that Victoria was helping him think through some important decisions. But he never offered specifics about what those decisions might involve. One afternoon, I overheard part of one of these conversations when I was arranging flowers in the hallway outside Bob's study. Victoria's voice carried through the partially open door, and what I heard made my blood run cold. Dad, I need you to really think about this carefully. Has Emma ever mentioned anything about your will? Even casually, even in passing? Maybe something about how grateful she is for everything you've done for her, or how she hopes you'll always remember her kindness? I don't think so, Bob replied uncertainly. She's never asked about inheritance or anything like that, but she might have made comments that seemed innocent but were actually hints about expecting some kind of reward for her service. Professional caregivers are trained to do this very subtly, Dad. They make emotional connections and then rely on their clients' gratitude to secure financial benefits. Emma's not like that, Bob said, but his voice lacked conviction. She's genuinely caring. I'm sure she seems that way, Victoria replied smoothly. But Dad, you have to consider the possibility that someone could be very good at hiding their true intentions. I've been researching caregiver fraud, and the cases all start the same way, with trusted employees who seem devoted until they find ways to manipulate their elderly clients into changing their wills. I backed away from the door before I could hear Bob's response, my heart pounding with anger and fear. Victoria was poisoning Bob's mind with lies about caregiver fraud, making him suspicious of the very qualities that made our relationship special: the genuine affection, the mutual respect, the sense of family connection that had developed naturally over 3 years. That evening, Bob's behavior toward me shifted in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. He thanked me effusively for small services I'd always provided without comment, as if he was suddenly conscious of keeping a balance sheet of favors and gratitude. He insisted on paying me extra for driving him to his dentist appointment, even though transportation had always been part of my regular duties. Most troubling, he began asking me direct questions about my expectations and assumptions regarding my future at Riverside Manor. Emma, he said as I helped him with his evening pills, a task that Patricia had reluctantly allowed me to continue under her supervision. I want to make sure you understand that your job here is secure as long as I need care. You don't have to worry about your position. The reassurance should have been comforting, but the way he said it suggested he thought I'd been worrying about job security when I hadn't been. Thank you, Bob. I've always felt secure here. Good. And you understand that your salary and benefits are quite generous for this type of position? You're not concerned about other forms of compensation or recognition? The question hung in the air between us like a trap waiting to spring. If I said yes, I was admitting to wanting more than my agreed-upon compensation. If I said no too emphatically, I might sound like I was protesting too much. I'm very satisfied with our arrangement, I said carefully. I've never expected anything beyond what we originally agreed upon. Bob nodded, but I could see him making mental notes, analyzing my response for hidden meanings that didn't exist. Of course. It's just that Jim mentioned you might have some natural concerns about your long-term security, given that you've devoted so much time to this position. There it was again. Another fictional conversation with Jim Patterson that had never happened. I was beginning to understand that Jim was conducting an elaborate gaslighting campaign, claiming to have discussed things with me that I'd never said, then reporting these imaginary conversations to Bob as evidence of my hidden agenda. "Bob," I said, sitting down across from him so I could look directly into his eyes, "I need you to understand something very clearly. I have never discussed my long-term security or financial concerns with Jim Patterson. I have never asked him about your will or estate planning. I have never hinted about expecting anything beyond my salary and the kindness you've always shown me." Bob stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. Part of him wanted to believe me, but Victoria and Jim had been very effective in their campaign to make him doubt his own judgment about my character. "But Jim was very specific about what you'd said," Bob replied slowly. "He even mentioned that you'd asked whether Catherine had left any instructions about taking care of longtime employees. When would I have had this conversation with Jim? He's never alone with me, Bob. We barely speak beyond saying hello and goodbye." Bob's forehead creased with confusion. "He said you'd approached him after one of his visits, that you'd seemed worried about what would happen to you if my health declined." The lie was so detailed, so specific, that I could see how Bob might believe it. Jim was creating an entire fictional narrative of conversations and concerns that painted me as someone secretly worried about my financial future and subtly pressuring Bob for reassurance about inheritance. That night, I called Maria again to update her on the escalating situation. Her advice was more urgent than before. "Emma, you need to start documenting everything," she said. "Write down every conversation, every accusation, every change in Bob's behavior. Take photos of anything suspicious. And for God's sake, consider installing some kind of recording device in your cottage to protect yourself if anyone tries to plant evidence or make false accusations." "That feels so paranoid," I protested. "It's not paranoid if people are actually plotting against you," Maria replied grimly. "And from what you're telling me, that's exactly what's happening. These people are building a case to remove you from Bob's life, possibly to steal from him, and they're doing it very systematically." Her words echoed in my mind as I lay awake that night, listening to the sounds of the old house settling around me. Somewhere in these rooms, people I'd trusted were planning my destruction with careful precision. They were using Bob's love for me against him, turning his kindness into evidence of impaired judgment, transforming my dedication into signs of manipulation. But they had made one crucial mistake. They underestimated my intelligence and my determination to protect Bob from whatever they were planning. If they wanted to play games with lies and manipulation, I would have to learn to play those games better than they did. The next morning, I began my own investigation into Victoria Mitchell and Jim Patterson, starting with the question that had been nagging at me since this whole nightmare began. What did they have to gain by destroying my relationship with Bob? And what were they planning to do with him once I was gone? The answers I found would be more shocking than I could have imagined. The morning that changed everything started like any other Tuesday at Riverside Manor, with Bob reading his newspapers in the sunroom while I prepared his breakfast. Patricia Williams had arrived for her usual medical check, and the routine felt almost normal, despite the underlying tension that had become part of our daily life. Then Bob collapsed. I was arranging fresh flowers in the dining room when I heard the crash of breaking china and Patricia's sharp call for help. I rushed to the sunroom to find Bob on the floor, convulsing violently while Patricia knelt beside him, trying to clear his airway. His breakfast tray lay scattered around him, coffee and orange juice soaking into the Persian rug that Catherine had loved. "Call 911, Patricia ordered, her professional training taking over. "Now." While I made the emergency call, Patricia worked to stabilize Bob, checking his pulse and breathing while the seizure gradually subsided. By the time the paramedics arrived, Bob was conscious but disoriented, asking repeatedly where he was and what had happened. The ambulance ride to Millbrook General Hospital passed in a blur of medical terminology and urgent radio communications. I sat in the back holding Bob's hand while paramedics monitored his vital signs and administered medication to prevent additional seizures. The ambulance ride to Millbrook General Hospital passed in a blur of medical terminology and urgent radio communications. I sat in the back holding Bob's hand while paramedics monitored his vital signs and administered medication to prevent additional seizures. Bob kept looking at me with confused, frightened eyes, asking the same questions over and over. "What happened to me, Emma? Why can't I remember eating breakfast? At the hospital, everything moved with terrifying efficiency. Bob was whisked away for emergency tests, while I found myself alone in a sterile waiting room, fielding phone calls from Victoria and Jim Patterson. Victoria's voice was sharp with accusation when she arrived 20 minutes later. "What exactly happened this morning?" she demanded, not bothering with pleasantries or asking about her father's condition. "The nurse said Dad had a seizure during breakfast. That's not consistent with his medical history." I explained what I'd witnessed, but Victoria's expression grew more skeptical with each detail. When I mentioned that Bob had seemed fine during his morning routine, she interrupted. "Define fine, Emma. Was he alert, responsive, or was he showing signs of confusion that you might have missed?" The questions felt like an interrogation, and I realized that even Bob's medical emergency was being twisted into evidence of my incompetence. "He was completely normal," I insisted. "We had our usual conversation about the weather and his plans for the day. He was reading his newspapers and seemed perfectly coherent." Jim Patterson arrived during this exchange, immediately pulling Victoria aside for a whispered conversation that I couldn't hear but could see was intense. When they returned, Jim's expression was grave. "Emma, I need to ask you some difficult questions about Bob's medication routine this morning," he said. "Dr. Chen will want a complete timeline of everything he consumed before the seizure." I recounted the morning in detail. Bob's usual medications at 7 a.m., coffee with his newspapers at 8, orange juice and toast at 8:30. Nothing unusual, nothing different from our established routine. "And you're certain about the medication timing?" Jim pressed. "No deviations from the schedule? No extra doses or missed doses?" The implication was clear. Jim was suggesting that I had made an error with Bob's medications that caused the seizure. "I'm absolutely certain," I said firmly. "Patricia Williams administered his morning medications herself. She's been handling all medical care for the past 2 weeks." Victoria and Jim exchanged another look that made my stomach turn. "Actually," Victoria said slowly, "Patricia mentioned that you'd asked to help with Dad's medications this morning. She said you insisted on handling his morning pills while she prepared his breakfast." My world tilted sideways. "That's not true. Patricia gave Bob his medications while I was arranging flowers in the dining room. I wasn't even in the same room." "Patricia's report indicates otherwise," Jim said, pulling out his phone. "I have her written statement right here. She says you specifically requested to handle the morning medication routine, claiming you wanted to maintain some of your original responsibilities." I stared at him in shock. Patricia Williams was lying, fabricating a story that made me responsible for Bob's medical crisis. But why would she risk her professional reputation to support Victoria and Jim's campaign against me? The answer came with sickening clarity. Patricia wasn't an independent medical professional hired to provide objective care. She was part of their plan, brought in specifically to create evidence of my incompetence and to provide credible testimony against me when the time came to remove me from Bob's life permanently. "I want to speak with Patricia directly," I demanded. "I want to hear her make these accusations to my face." "She's giving her statement to Dr. Chen and the hospital administration," Victoria replied smoothly. "Patient safety is the priority right now, not your hurt feelings." Before I could respond, Dr. Chen emerged from the emergency department looking tired and concerned. She pulled Victoria and Jim aside for a private conversation, but I could hear fragments of their discussion that made my blood run cold. Medication interaction, unusual presentation, possible overdose or contraindication, need to review all substances consumed this morning. When Dr. Chen finally approached me, her expression was professional but distant. "Emma, I need you to walk me through every detail of Mr. Mitchell's morning routine. The hospital needs to understand exactly what might have triggered this seizure." I repeated my account for what felt like the 100th time, emphasizing that Patricia had handled all medical care while I focused on household duties. Dr. Chen listened without comment, taking notes that seemed to carry the weight of evidence in a criminal case. "Emma," Dr. Chen said when I finished, "I'm going to need you to remain available for additional questions. The hospital administration may want to conduct a formal review of this incident." The words hit me like a physical blow. A formal review meant an official investigation, documentation that would follow me for the rest of my career, possibly criminal charges if they could prove negligence or intentional harm. Victoria and Jim had engineered a crisis that would destroy my reputation and remove me from Bob's life in one devastating blow. As the hours passed in the hospital waiting room, I watched Victoria and Jim work their strategy with ruthless efficiency. They spoke in hushed tones with hospital administrators, providing character references for Patricia Williams, while expressing growing concerns about my emotional stability and professional competence. They painted a picture of a caregiver who had become too attached to her patient, who had overstepped professional boundaries, and who might have made critical errors out of misguided attempts to maintain control over Bob's care. The most insidious part of their campaign was how they used Bob's genuine affection for me against him. When he regained consciousness and asked for me repeatedly, Victoria explained to the medical staff that this was evidence of an unhealthy dependency that had developed over time. "Dad's become unusually attached to Emma," she told the nurse coordinator. "It's been a growing concern for our family. He sometimes seems to trust her judgment over medical professionals, which obviously creates dangerous situations." When I was finally allowed to see Bob, he was groggy from sedatives but alert enough to recognize me. His face lit up with relief when I entered his room. "Emma, thank God you're here. They keep asking me questions I can't answer. What happened to me this morning? Why can't I remember anything after breakfast?" I took his hand gently, trying to hide my own fear and confusion. "You had a seizure, Bob. The doctors are running tests to figure out what caused it." Bob's grip tightened on my hand. "Victoria said there might have been a problem with my medications. She said you were handling them this morning instead of Patricia. Is that true?" The question felt like a knife twisting in my chest. Even Bob was beginning to doubt me, beginning to wonder if I had somehow caused his medical crisis. "No, Bob. Patricia gave you your medications exactly as prescribed. I was in the dining room when it happened." Bob studied my face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "But Victoria seemed so certain. And Patricia told the doctors," she said. "What did Patricia tell them?" Bob's expression grew more confused and distressed. "She said you'd insisted on helping with my pills this morning. She said you seemed upset about being excluded from my medical care. She said she was worried about leaving you alone with my medications but didn't want to create conflict." Every word was a carefully constructed lie designed to make me look emotionally unstable and professionally dangerous. Patricia Williams had created a narrative that explained both the seizure and my alleged motivation for causing it, a desperate attempt to prove my value by taking control of Bob's medical care. "Bob," I said quietly, "I need you to think very carefully about this morning. Do you remember me being in the sunroom when you took your pills? Do you remember any interaction between Patricia and me about your medications?" Bob closed his eyes and concentrated. But when he opened them, his expression was helpless. "I can't remember clearly. Everything's foggy. The doctors said that's normal after a seizure. But Victoria said it might be because someone gave me the wrong medications." That evening, as I sat alone in the hospital cafeteria trying to process the nightmare my life had become, Maria arrived with a grim expression and a manila envelope full of documents. "I've been doing research," she said without preamble. "Victoria Mitchell, Jim Patterson, and Patricia Williams. Want to know what I found?" I nodded, though part of me was afraid to hear the answer. "Patricia Williams lost her previous job at Hartford Medical Center 6 months ago," Maria began. "Official reason was policy violations, but my friend who works there said she was caught falsifying patient records to cover up medication errors. She should never have been hired to provide private care." My stomach lurched. "How is that possible? Don't caregiving agencies do background checks?" "They do if you go through legitimate agencies," Maria replied. "But Patricia wasn't hired through an agency. Jim Patterson hired her directly, using his law firm's letterhead to provide references that couldn't be verified easily." She pulled out more documents. "Victoria Mitchell's been having financial problems for the past year. Mitchell Textiles lost 2 major government contracts, and there are rumors of cash flow issues. The company stock has dropped 60%, and Victoria's been selling personal assets to keep the business afloat." The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a clear picture. Victoria needed money desperately, and Bob's estate represented millions of dollars that could save her failing business. But she couldn't access that money while Bob was alive and competent, and she certainly couldn't access it if Bob's will included substantial provisions for his caregiver. There's more, Maria continued. Jim Patterson's law firm is facing a malpractice lawsuit from another family who claims he mishandled their father's estate. The suit alleges that Jim manipulated an elderly client into changing his will to exclude family members and that he personally benefited from the changes. I felt sick. So they're using the same playbook they've used before. It gets worse, Maria said grimly. I checked public records for Patricia Williams. She's been involved in 3 previous cases where elderly patients under her care had, quote, medical emergencies that resulted in changes to their living situations. In each case, the families hired her to provide evidence of caregiver incompetence or abuse. The systematic nature of their scheme was breathtaking in its cruelty. They had assembled a team of experienced manipulators who specialized in destroying caregivers and isolating elderly clients from anyone who might protect them. Bob wasn't their first victim, and I wasn't their first target. Maria, I said quietly, they're going to destroy me. Even if I can prove Patricia is lying about this morning, the investigation will ruin my reputation. I'll never work in caregiving again. Not if we can prove they're running a con, Maria replied. Emma, you said Bob keeps a journal, right? And you mentioned that he's been agitated after meetings with Victoria and Jim. What if his own words could prove that they've been manipulating him? Hope flickered in my chest for the first time since Bob's seizure. His journal is in his study at the manor. But I can't access it now. Victoria will have someone watching the house. Then we need to get back there tonight, before they have a chance to destroy evidence or plant anything that makes you look guilty, Maria said. Emma, if we don't act now, they're going to succeed in everything they've planned. As we left the hospital and drove through the dark Connecticut countryside toward Riverside Manor, I realized that the next few hours would determine not just my future, but Bob's safety and possibly his life. Victoria and Jim had orchestrated one crisis to remove me from the picture. But what would they do to Bob once they had complete control over his care and his assets? The answer to that question was waiting for us at the manor, hidden in Bob's private papers and recorded in his own words. But getting to that evidence would require taking risks that could land me in jail if I was caught, and trusting that Bob's own testimony would be enough to expose the people who claimed to love him most. The stakes had never been higher. And I was about to discover that sometimes the only way to save someone you love is to risk everything you have, including your freedom and your future. The manor looked different in the darkness, more ominous and forbidding than the welcoming home I'd known for 3 years. As Maria and I approached the estate, I could see lights on in Bob's study and Victoria's car in the driveway. They were already there, already working to cover their tracks and prepare for the next phase of their plan. Whatever they were doing in that study, I had to stop them before they destroyed the evidence that could save both Bob and me. But I also had to be smarter than they were, more careful than they expected, and more determined than they could imagine. The real battle for Bob's life and my future was about to begin, and I was going into it with nothing but my love for a confused old man and my sister's unwavering support. It would have to be enough, because failure meant losing everything I'd worked for and leaving Bob defenseless against people who saw him only as a source of money to be exploited. The time for being the quiet, invisible caregiver was over. Tonight I would fight back with everything I had, and I would either save us both or go down fighting for the truth. The lights in Bob's study grew brighter as we approached, and I could see shadows moving behind the curtains. Victoria and Jim were in there, probably going through Bob's personal papers, looking for anything that might implicate them or protect me. They thought they had won, thought they had successfully removed the only person who stood between them and Bob's fortune. They were about to learn that they had seriously underestimated the woman they'd tried so hard to destroy. Maria and I crouched behind the gardening shed, watching the shadows move across the windows of Bob's study. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized we were about to break into the home where I'd lived peacefully for 3 years. Now transformed into enemy territory by people I'd once trusted. There's a spare key under the 3rd flower pot by the kitchen door, I whispered to Maria. But we need to wait until they leave the study. If they catch us. They won't, Maria said, with more confidence than I felt. Victoria's car is the only one here, which means Jim left already. Once she's done with whatever she's doing in there, she'll probably go upstairs to Bob's bedroom to look for more evidence to use against you. We waited in the cold October air for what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes. Finally, the study lights went out, and we saw Victoria's silhouette moving through the house toward the main staircase. This was our chance. Moving as quietly as possible, we approached the kitchen door. My hands shook as I retrieved the spare key from its hiding place under Catherine's old ceramic flower pot. The key turned with a soft click that sounded deafening in the night silence. The house felt alien in the darkness, full of familiar shapes that seemed menacing without the warm lighting that had always made Riverside Manor feel like home. We made our way through the kitchen and down the hallway toward Bob's study, freezing every time a floorboard creaked under our feet. Bob's study door was slightly ajar, and I could see that Victoria had left the room in chaos. Papers were scattered across his desk, file cabinets stood open, and books had been pulled from shelves and left in piles on the floor. She'd been conducting a thorough search for something specific. "What exactly are we looking for?" Maria whispered as we entered the room. "Bob's journal," I replied, moving toward his desk where he always kept the leather-bound book. "He writes in it every evening. If Victoria and Jim have been manipulating him, threatening him, or pressuring him to change his will, he would have recorded it. But the journal wasn't in its usual place on the desk." I searched through the scattered papers, growing more desperate with each passing moment. Had Victoria already found it and taken it? Was this entire risky mission for nothing? Then I remembered something Bob had told me months ago about Catherine's secret hiding places. She'd been paranoid about burglars and had created several concealed compartments throughout the house for storing valuables. Bob had shown me one of them behind a false panel in his study bookshelf, saying it made him feel closer to Catherine to use her old hiding spots. I ran my hands along the bookshelf until I found the panel that moved slightly under pressure. Behind it was a small cavity containing Bob's journal, along with several legal documents and a manila envelope marked, "For Emma, to be opened only in emergency." My breath caught in my throat. Bob had left something specifically for me, hidden away where only I would know to look for it. With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope and found a letter in Bob's careful handwriting, dated just 2 weeks ago. "My dear Emma," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then something has happened to me, and the people I trusted most have shown their true nature. I have become aware that Victoria and Jim Patterson are planning to have me declared incompetent so they can take control of my assets. They believe I am too senile to understand their scheme, but I have been more alert than they realize." I grabbed Maria's arm, pulling her closer so she could read over my shoulder. The letter continued. "Victoria has been pressuring me to change my will to remove the provisions Catherine insisted on making for you and the other staff members. She claims these provisions are legally vulnerable and could be challenged in court, but Jim's real concern is that they reduce the inheritance he and Victoria expect to receive. They have been systematically undermining my trust in you, hoping to make me believe you are manipulating me for financial gain." My eyes filled with tears as I read Bob's next words. "Emma, I want you to know that I have never doubted your genuine care for me. Your kindness has been a light in my life since Catherine's death, and I refuse to let their poison destroy what we have built together. However, I fear they may take drastic action to remove you from my life permanently. Patricia Williams is not a legitimate nurse. She is an actress Jim hired to provide false testimony about your competence. I overheard them planning to create a medical emergency that would be blamed on your negligence." The revelation hit me like a lightning bolt. Bob had known about their plan all along. He'd been aware that Patricia was a fraud, that Victoria and Jim were plotting against both of us, but he'd been trapped by their manipulation and his own failing health. "There's more," Maria whispered, pointing to the bottom of the letter. "I have been secretly recording my conversations with Victoria and Jim for the past month. The recording device is hidden behind the family photograph on my desk. Catherine always said that people reveal their true selves when they think no one is listening. I pray that these recordings will provide the evidence needed to protect you and expose their crimes. Trust Dr. Chen. She has been my friend for 30 years and will help you if you show her this letter. I am sorry I was not strong enough to protect you myself, but please know that you have been the daughter of my heart that Victoria never chose to be. I looked up at the family photograph Bob had mentioned, a formal portrait of him, Catherine, and a young Victoria taken 20 years ago. Behind the frame, just as Bob had described, was a small digital recording device no bigger than a matchbox. Emma, Maria breathed. This is it. This is the evidence that will destroy them. But before I could respond, we heard footsteps on the stairs. Victoria was coming back down, probably having finished searching Bob's bedroom. We had maybe 30 seconds before she reached the study. I grabbed Bob's journal, the letter, and the recording device, shoving them into my jacket pockets. Maria was already moving toward the window, but I realized we'd never make it out without being seen. Instead, I pulled her behind the heavy curtains that covered the large window facing the garden. We pressed ourselves against the wall just as Victoria entered the study. Through a gap in the curtains, I could see her surveying the chaos she'd created, clearly frustrated that she hadn't found whatever she'd been looking for. Victoria pulled out her phone and made a call. "Jim, it's not here," she said in a voice tight with anger. "I've torn the study apart and there's no sign of the journal or any recordings. Are you sure he said he was keeping evidence?" I couldn't hear Jim's response, but Victoria's reply made my blood run cold. "Then we move to phase 2 tonight. The hospital sedatives will make it look natural, and with Emma already under suspicion for this morning's incident, no one will question a second medical emergency. By morning, all our problems will be solved permanently." My heart stopped. They weren't just planning to steal Bob's money or have me arrested for negligence. They were planning to kill him tonight while he was vulnerable in the hospital, making it look like a result of the seizure or complications from his medications. Victoria ended the call and left the study, but we could hear her moving around the house, probably collecting items she would need for whatever they had planned at the hospital. We waited until we heard her car start and drive away before emerging from our hiding place. "Maria," I said, my voice shaking with horror and determination. "We have to get to the hospital immediately. They're gonna kill Bob tonight." "We need to call the police," Maria replied, but I was already shaking my head. "With what evidence? A letter that could be forged and recordings we haven't even listened to yet?" Victoria and Jim are respected members of the community with no criminal records. I'm already under investigation for medical negligence. Who do you think the police will believe? Instead, we drove directly to Millbrook General Hospital, where I used my caregiver credentials to access the building through the staff entrance. Maria waited in the parking lot with instructions to call 911 if I didn't emerge within 30 minutes. The cardiac care unit where Bob was staying was dimly lit, with only a skeleton crew of nurses monitoring patients through the night shift. I made my way to Bob's room, expecting to find him sleeping peacefully, but what I discovered there made my blood freeze in my veins. Jim Patterson was standing beside Bob's bed wearing scrubs that made him look like a legitimate medical professional. In his hand was a syringe filled with clear liquid that he was preparing to inject into Bob's IV line. Bob was unconscious, probably already sedated beyond the point of awakening. "Stop," I said quietly from the doorway. Jim spun around, his face cycling through surprise, anger, and calculated menace in the space of a heartbeat. "Emma," he said, with that same smooth voice he'd always used to manipulate Bob. "You really shouldn't be here. Visiting hours ended long ago. Put down the syringe, Jim." He glanced at the needle in his hand as if he'd forgotten he was holding it. "This? It's just additional sedative prescribed by Dr. Chen." Bob was having trouble sleeping, so I offered to help the nursing staff with his comfort care. "You're not medical personnel. You have no authority to administer medications." Jim's expression hardened. "And you're a caregiver under investigation for medical negligence who has no business being in this hospital. I think security would be very interested to know you're here harassing Bob's family during a medical crisis you may have caused." But I was no longer the frightened, isolated woman I'd been that morning. I'd found my strength, and I had evidence that would destroy him. I know about Patricia Williams, I said calmly. I know she's not a real nurse. I know you hired her to fabricate evidence against me. Jim's facade slipped for just a moment, revealing the cold calculation underneath. That's quite an accusation, Emma. Can you prove any of it? I know about Victoria's financial problems with Mitchell Textiles. I know about your history of manipulating elderly clients and stealing their assets. And I know what's really in that syringe. You know nothing, Jim said, but his voice had lost its confident smoothness. You're a delusional woman who's become obsessed with an elderly man and his money. Everyone can see it. The doctors, the hospital staff, even Bob himself is starting to understand how you've manipulated him. I pulled out my phone and showed him that I'd been recording our conversation. Would you like to repeat that for the recording? Especially the part where you explain why you're in Bob's hospital room at midnight with a syringe full of what I'm guessing is a lethal dose of morphine? Jim's eyes went wide with panic. He lunged toward me, trying to grab the phone, but I was already backing toward the hallway where the security cameras would capture everything. Security! I shouted as loudly as I could. Code blue. Someone's trying to kill a patient. The hospital erupted into controlled chaos as nurses and security guards converged on Bob's room. Jim tried to claim he was Bob's attorney providing authorized medical assistance, but his story fell apart when the head nurse confirmed that no additional sedatives had been prescribed and that Jim had no legal authority to be in the room, let alone to handle medical equipment. While security detained Jim, I showed Dr. Chen the letter Bob had written and played portions of the recorded conversations from the device we'd found in his study. The recordings were devastating. Hours of Victoria and Jim discussing their plan to manipulate Bob into changing his will, their scheme to frame me for medical negligence, and their ultimate intention to eliminate Bob once they had secured control of his assets. My God, drive! Chen whispered as she listened to Victoria's voice describing how they would make Bob's death look like natural complications from his seizure. I've known Bob for 30 years. I trusted these people completely. The syringe Jim had been preparing to inject into Bob's IV line was tested and found to contain a concentrated morphine solution that would have stopped his heart within minutes. Combined with the evidence from Bob's recordings, it was enough to have both Jim and Victoria arrested on charges of attempted murder, elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. Victoria was arrested at her hotel room, where police found detailed plans for liquidating Bob's assets after his death, forged medical documents that would have supported claims of his incompetence, and communications with Patricia Williams about her role in fabricating evidence against me. Patricia Williams was arrested at her apartment, where police discovered that she'd been involved in similar schemes in 3 other states, always working with unscrupulous lawyers and family members to isolate elderly victims from their genuine caregivers before stealing their assets. Bob recovered fully from his medically induced seizure once the foreign substances Victoria and Jim had been secretly adding to his medications were eliminated from his system. The cognitive decline that had been used to justify their intervention disappeared entirely, revealing that they'd been poisoning him gradually to make him appear more confused and dependent than he actually was. 6 months later, I stood in the garden at Riverside Manor, watching Bob tend to Catherine's roses with the energy and clarity he'd always possessed before Victoria and Jim began their campaign of manipulation. The legal proceedings had been swift and decisive. All 3 conspirators received lengthy prison sentences for their crimes, and Bob's estate was restored to its original condition with all of Catherine's provisions intact. Emma, Bob called from across the garden, come see these new blooms. Catherine would have loved them. I joined him among the roses, marveling at how completely our world had been restored after coming so close to complete destruction. Bob had asked me to stay on as his companion and estate manager, but more importantly, he'd asked me to be the family he'd always considered me to be. You know, Bob said as we walked back toward the house, Catherine always said that people's true nature comes out under pressure. She was right about Victoria and Jim, but she was also right about you. When everything fell apart, you fought for what was right instead of running away to save yourself. That evening, as we sat in the library reading together like we had for 3 years before the nightmare began, Bob handed me a new document, adoption papers that would legally make me his daughter and heir, ensuring that no one could ever again question my place in his life or my right to call Riverside Manor home. Family isn't about blood, Bob said quietly. It's about choosing to love someone and stand by them no matter what. You chose to love me when I had nothing to offer but an old man's stories and Catherine's rose garden. Now I'm choosing to love you back in the only way that matters, permanently and unconditionally. I thought about all the pain and fear we'd endured, all the lies and manipulation we'd survived, and realized that sometimes the darkest plots against us reveal the brightest truths about who we really are and who truly deserves our trust. Victoria and Jim had tried to destroy me because they feared the genuine love Bob and I shared, but in the end, that love had been stronger than all their schemes combined. As I signed the adoption papers that would make me Emma Mitchell, I understood that home isn't a place you live. It's a place where someone fights for you when you can't fight for yourself, where someone sees your true worth when others try to diminish it, and where someone chooses you not because they have to, but because they want to. Bob and I had both been chosen by people who claimed to love us but wanted to use us. But we'd also chosen each other, and that choice had saved us both. In the end, the people who planned our downfall had given us the greatest gift of all, the chance to prove that real family is built on love, loyalty, and the courage to fight for what's right, no matter the cost. The estate that had nearly become my prison had become my true home, and the man I'd served as a caregiver had become the father I'd always needed. Sometimes the best families are the ones we create, by choosing to protect each other through the worst storms life can bring. And sometimes, when you think you're just the caretaker, you discover you were always meant to be so much more. The weeks following the hospital incident transformed Riverside Manor into something resembling a crime scene investigation. Federal agents specializing in elder fraud arrived with boxes of equipment, spending days photographing documents, analyzing Bob's medical records, and interviewing staff members who had witnessed the gradual changes in household dynamics over the past 8 months. Detective Sarah Morrison, the lead investigator on the case, was a woman in her 50s who specialized in financial crimes against the elderly. She had seen enough cases like this to recognize the sophisticated nature of Victoria and Jim's operation, but she told me privately that our case was unique in its scope and cruelty. Most elder abuse cases involve family members who get greedy and make impulsive decisions, Detective Morrison explained as we sat in Bob's study, now restored to its original order. But this was different. This was a calculated, long-term operation designed to systematically destroy your credibility while slowly poisoning Mr. Mitchell to make him appear incompetent. The level of premeditation here is extraordinary. The investigation revealed details that were more disturbing than I could have imagined. Jim Patterson had been planning to manipulate Bob's estate for over 2 years, ever since his law firm began facing serious financial difficulties due to the malpractice lawsuit Maria had discovered. Victoria's involvement had begun 18 months ago when Mitchell Textiles started losing government contracts due to her poor management decisions. They weren't just trying to steal Mr. Mitchell's money, Detective Morrison continued. They were trying to take control of Mitchell Textiles itself. With Bob declared incompetent and you removed from the picture, Victoria would have had complete authority over both the personal estate and the business assets. We're talking about a theft that could have reached $50 million. The depth of their deception became clear as investigators traced their activities back to the beginning. Patricia Williams wasn't just a fraudulent nurse. She was part of a network of criminals who specialized in elder abuse schemes. She had worked with Jim Patterson on at least 4 previous cases, always playing the role of the concerned medical professional who could provide credible testimony about caregiver incompetence. But the most shocking revelation came when investigators analyzed the substances that had been secretly added to Bob's medications. Victoria and Jim hadn't just been making him appear confused. They had been slowly poisoning him with compounds that would have eventually caused permanent brain damage or death, even without the final injection Jim had planned to administer at the hospital. Your Mr. Mitchell was probably 6 weeks away from serious neurological damage, Dr. Chen told me during one of Bob's follow-up appointments. The combination of substances they were giving him was designed to mimic the progression of dementia, while actually causing the symptoms they claimed to be treating. It's one of the most sophisticated medical fraud cases I've ever encountered. Bob's recovery was remarkable once the foreign substances were eliminated from his system. Within days, his confusion cleared, his memory sharpened, and his natural energy returned. But the emotional healing took longer. He struggled with guilt over having doubted me, even though I repeatedly assured him that he'd been fighting the effects of deliberate poisoning and psychological manipulation. "Emma," he said one evening as we worked together in Catherine's garden, "I keep thinking about all the times I questioned your motives, all the moments when I believed their lies instead of trusting what I knew in my heart about you. How can you forgive me for that?" I looked up from the roses I was pruning, seeing the pain in his eyes that had nothing to do with physical illness. "Bob, you were being systematically poisoned and manipulated by people you had every reason to trust. The fact that you still found ways to protect me, even while they were clouding your judgment, shows how strong your love really is." The legal proceedings moved swiftly once the evidence was compiled. Victoria Mitchell was charged with attempted murder, elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy, and embezzlement. The investigation revealed that she had been stealing from Mitchell Textiles for over a year, using company funds to finance her personal expenses, while the business struggled with legitimate financial problems. Jim Patterson faced similar charges, along with additional counts related to his history of manipulating elderly clients. The investigation into his law firm revealed a pattern of exploitation going back 5 years, with at least 8 families who had been victims of similar schemes. His professional license was revoked, and he faced decades in prison. Patricia Williams pled guilty to multiple charges of fraud and conspiracy in exchange for testimony against Victoria and Jim. Her cooperation led investigators to 2 other ongoing cases in neighboring states where elderly victims were being manipulated by the same network of criminals. But the legal victories, satisfying as they were, couldn't erase the trauma of what we had endured. Bob suffered from nightmares about being helpless, while people he trusted tried to kill him. I struggled with anxiety about trusting new people, wondering if I would ever again be able to take others at face value without looking for hidden agendas. The healing process was gradual, and sometimes set back by unexpected triggers. The first time Dr. Chen prescribed new medication for Bob's blood pressure, I found myself obsessively checking and rechecking the dosage, terrified that someone might have tampered with it. Bob had panic attacks when strangers came to the house, even legitimate service providers we had used for years. But we helped each other through the recovery process, drawing strength from the knowledge that we had survived something designed to destroy us both. Our evening conversations in the library became a form of therapy, talking through our fears and anger while rebuilding the trust that Victoria and Jim had tried so hard to poison. 3 months after the arrests, Maria brought me a newspaper article that made us both smile for the first time in weeks. Victoria Mitchell had been sentenced to 25 years in prison, with no possibility of parole for 15 years. Jim Patterson received 30 years, and Patricia Williams got 12 years for her cooperation with authorities. "Justice," Maria said simply, setting the newspaper on the kitchen table where Bob and I were having breakfast. Bob picked up the article and read it slowly, his expression cycling through satisfaction, sadness, and something that looked like relief. "I keep thinking about how Catherine would have reacted to all this," he said finally. "She never trusted Victoria completely, you know. She used to say that Victoria looked at people like they were bank accounts rather than human beings." That afternoon, Bob asked me to join him in his study for what he called an important conversation about our future. I followed him into the room where so much pain had been planned, and where the evidence of our salvation had been hidden. "Emma," Bob began, settling into the leather chair behind his desk, "I've been thinking about what we've learned from this experience, about what really matters in life and what doesn't." I sat across from him, noting how much stronger and more alert he looked compared to the confused, frightened man he had been during the worst of Victoria and Jim's manipulation. "What I've learned," Bob continued, "is that family isn't about blood relationships or legal obligations. It's about choosing to love someone and stand by them when everything falls apart. You chose to fight for me when you could have just walked away to protect yourself. You chose to believe in our relationship even when I was being made to doubt it." I felt tears forming in my eyes, remembering how close we had come to losing everything that mattered. "I want to make some changes," Bob said, pulling out a manila folder thick with legal documents. "First, I want to officially adopt you as my daughter. Not just for inheritance purposes, but because that's what you've always been in my heart. The words hit me like a warm wave, washing away months of fear and uncertainty. Bob, you don't have to do that. What we have doesn't need legal documentation. Yes, it does, Bob replied firmly. What we've been through has taught me that love without legal protection is vulnerable to attack. I won't let anyone ever again question your place in this family, or your right to call this house your home. He handed me the adoption papers, already prepared and requiring only our signatures to make our chosen family relationship official and unbreakable. There's more, Bob continued, pulling out additional documents. I'm establishing a foundation in Catherine's name that will help other elderly people who are being exploited by family members or caregivers. You'll be the executive director, with full authority to investigate suspected abuse cases and provide legal support to victims. The idea was beautiful and meaningful, a way to transform our painful experience into something that could protect others from similar exploitation. Bob, that's an incredible idea, but I don't have experience running a foundation. You have something more valuable than experience, Bob replied. You have first-hand knowledge of how these schemes work and the determination to stop them. Plus, we'll hire the best staff money can buy to handle the technical aspects. Over the following weeks, we worked together to establish the Catherine Mitchell Foundation for Elder Protection. Using a portion of Bob's estate that Victoria had tried so hard to steal, we created an organization dedicated to investigating elder abuse, supporting victims, and prosecuting criminals who prey on vulnerable seniors. The Foundation's first case came from Detective Morrison, who had been contacted by a family in Massachusetts whose elderly father was showing signs of being manipulated by his new caregiver, and a lawyer who claimed to be updating his estate planning. The similarities to our own experience were chilling, but this time we were prepared to intervene before irreversible harm was done. Working with local authorities and medical professionals, the Foundation was able to expose another elder abuse ring and save a man whose family had been systematically excluded from his life by criminals who planned to steal his assets. The case made national news and established the Foundation as a legitimate resource for families dealing with suspected elder abuse. 6 months after Victoria's sentencing, Bob and I stood in the courthouse in Hartford, Connecticut, as a judge officially finalized my adoption. At 68 years old, Bob became my legal father, and I became Emma Mitchell, his chosen daughter and heir. You know, Bob said, as we walked down the courthouse steps together, Catherine always said that the best gifts in life are the ones you don't expect. She was talking about you, even though we didn't realize it at the time. That evening, we celebrated with a quiet dinner in the dining room at Riverside Manor, the same room where Victoria and Jim had planned our destruction only months before. The house felt completely different now, lighter, warmer, filled with hope instead of fear. Maria joined us for the celebration, bringing a bottle of champagne Catherine had been saving for a special occasion. As we raised our glasses to toast our new family, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. To Catherine, Bob said, who somehow knew that love is stronger than greed, that chosen family is more powerful than blood relationships, and that good people will always find ways to protect each other. To Catherine, Maria and I echoed, and I felt a presence in the room that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with love that transcends time and circumstance. Later that night, as I sat in my cottage looking out over the gardens that would always be my home, I reflected on how completely my life had changed. A year ago, I had been Emma Rodriguez, a caregiver grateful for a good job and a kind employer. Tonight, I was Emma Mitchell, daughter and heir to a man who had chosen me as family, director of a foundation that would protect vulnerable seniors, and a survivor of a conspiracy that had tried to destroy everything I held dear. The attempt on our lives had failed, but it had also revealed truths about love, loyalty, and courage that I might never have discovered otherwise. Sometimes the people who try to destroy you end up giving you the greatest gifts of all, the knowledge of your own strength, the certainty of who truly loves you, and the determination to fight for what's right no matter what the cost. Bob and I had both been targeted by people who saw us as obstacles to wealth and power, but we had survived because we chose to protect each other instead of ourselves. Because we believed in the love we shared even when others tried to convince us it was false. And because we refused to let fear and greed triumph over hope and truth. As I turned off the lights in my cottage and prepared for sleep, I smiled thinking about the foundation cases we would take on tomorrow, the elderly victims we would help, and the criminals we would stop before they could destroy other families the way Victoria and Jim had tried to destroy ours. The estate where I had once been just the caretaker had become the headquarters for a mission that would protect vulnerable seniors across the country. The man whose care had been my job had become my father in every way that mattered. And the experience that had nearly destroyed us both had instead taught us that the strongest families are built not on obligation or inheritance, but on the choice to love someone unconditionally and fight for them when they cannot fight for themselves. In the end, Victoria and Jim's elaborate plan to destroy us had accomplished exactly the opposite of what they intended. Instead of separating us, their attacks had made our bond unbreakable. Instead of stealing Bob's assets, their greed had inspired the creation of a foundation that would protect countless other seniors from similar exploitation. Instead of silencing me, their lies had given me a platform to speak for victims who might otherwise have no voice. Sometimes the worst things that happen to you become the foundation for the best things you'll ever do. Sometimes the people who plan your downfall end up elevating you to heights you never imagined possible. And sometimes, when you think you're just taking care of someone else, you discover that you were both taking care of each other all along. The manor settled into peaceful quiet around me, and for the first time in months, I fell asleep without fear, knowing that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to turn our painful experience into protection for others who needed someone to fight for them, the way Bob and I had fought for each other. 2 years after the trials concluded, and Victoria, Jim, and Patricia began serving their prison sentences, the Catherine Mitchell Foundation had grown into something neither Bob nor I could have imagined when we first conceived it. What started as our way of healing from trauma had evolved into a nationally recognized organization that had helped expose over 30 elder abuse cases and saved countless seniors from financial exploitation and worse. Our latest case had just concluded successfully when I received a phone call that would test everything we had learned about family, forgiveness, and the power of second chances. The voice on the other end was familiar but unexpected. It was Victoria, calling from the women's correctional facility where she was serving her sentence. "Emma," she said, her voice stripped of the entitled arrogance I remembered. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I need to speak with you about something important. It's about Dad, and about things I should have said years ago." My first instinct was to hang up immediately. Victoria had tried to kill both Bob and me, had systematically destroyed our trust and peace of mind, and had shown no remorse during the trial proceedings. What could she possibly have to say now that would matter? But something in her tone was different. Broken, humbled in a way I had never heard before. Against my better judgment, I found myself agreeing to visit her the following week, though I insisted that Bob not be told about the call until I understood what Victoria wanted. The Connecticut Women's Correctional Institution was a stark, depressing place that seemed designed to strip away dignity, along with freedom. I went through the security procedures with growing uncertainty about whether this visit was a mistake, but my curiosity about Victoria's motives overrode my reluctance to see her again. Victoria looked older than her 40 years when she entered the visiting room. Her carefully maintained appearance had given way to gray hair and tired eyes, and the confident bearing that had once intimidated me was gone completely. She sat across from me at the metal table, staring at her hands for a long moment before speaking. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly. "I wasn't sure you would. I'm not sure why I did," I replied honestly. "What do you want, Victoria?" Victoria looked up at me with eyes that held something I had never seen before. Genuine remorse. "I want to tell you about my mother, about Catherine, and about why I became the person who tried to destroy you." I settled back in my chair, prepared for whatever manipulation or excuse Victoria was about to offer. But what came next surprised me completely. "Catherine wasn't my biological mother," Victoria began, her voice barely above a whisper. "My real mother died when I was 3, and Dad married Catherine when I was 5. She tried to love me, tried to be the mother I needed, but I resented her for not being my real mother. I spent my childhood punishing her for trying to replace someone I barely remembered." This revelation shifted something in my understanding of the family dynamics I had observed over the years. I had always wondered why Victoria seemed so distant from Catherine's memory, why she showed little emotion when discussing her stepmother's death. Catherine loved Dad with everything she had, Victoria continued, and she tried to love me the same way. But I was angry, bitter, convinced that she was an intruder in our family. I rejected every attempt she made to connect with me, every gesture of love she offered. By the time I was old enough to understand what I had lost, she had stopped trying. Victoria wiped away tears with the back of her hand, a gesture so vulnerable it was hard to reconcile with the calculating woman who had orchestrated our near destruction. When Catherine got sick, she asked to speak with me privately, Victoria said. I thought she was going to lecture me about taking better care of Dad, about being a more dutiful daughter. Instead, she told me that she had always known I didn't accept her as my mother, but that she had never stopped loving me anyway. The visiting room around us faded, as Victoria's story drew me into a past I had never known existed. She said she was worried about Dad being alone after she died, worried that I was too busy with my own life to really take care of him. She said she wanted to find someone who would love him the way she did, someone who would see him as family rather than obligation. She said she was going to make sure that person was protected in his will, that they would never have to worry about being cast aside when he was gone. My breath caught as I realized what Victoria was telling me. Catherine hadn't just approved of Bob's affection for me, she had actively planned for it, had foreseen the relationship that would develop between us, and had taken steps to protect it. I was so angry, Victoria admitted. Angry that she was planning to give family money to a stranger, angry that she trusted some future caregiver more than she trusted her own stepdaughter. I felt like she was rejecting me one final time, choosing someone else over the child she had raised. Victoria looked directly at me for the first time since she had begun speaking. When you came to work for Dad and I saw how much he cared about you, how happy you made him, all that anger came flooding back. It wasn't really about the money, Emma. It was about watching my father love you the way he had never quite loved me, seeing you become the daughter Catherine had always wanted me to be. The honesty in Victoria's confession was devastating and illuminating. Her attempts to destroy me hadn't been driven by simple greed. They had been fueled by a lifetime of feeling like an outsider in her own family, by the pain of watching someone else receive the unconditional love she had always craved but never known how to accept. That doesn't excuse what I did, Victoria said quickly. Nothing excuses trying to kill innocent people or steal from my own father. I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for me or to minimize the harm I caused. I'm telling you because you deserve to know the truth about Catherine's intentions and about why I became someone capable of such terrible things. We sat in silence for several minutes while I processed everything Victoria had told me. The family dynamics I thought I understood had been far more complex than I had realized, shaped by losses and resentments that went back decades before I entered their lives. There's something else, Victoria said, pulling a folded piece of paper from her pocket. I've been writing letters to Dad, trying to apologize for what I did, trying to explain why I became someone he couldn't recognize. The prison censors all our mail, and I know he's probably thrown them away without reading them, but I needed to try. She handed me the letter, and I could see that it was addressed to Bob in Victoria's handwriting but had never been mailed. I was hoping you might read it and decide whether Dad could handle hearing from me. I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't want anything from him. I just want him to know that I understand now what I threw away, and that I'm sorry for the pain I caused both of you. I took the letter but didn't open it immediately. Victoria, why are you telling me all this now? What do you hope to accomplish? Victoria's smile was sad but genuine. I've had 2 years to think about my life, about the choices I made and the person I became. I've been in counseling, working through the anger and resentment that poisoned my relationship with Catherine and Dad. I've learned things about myself that I never wanted to face. She paused, seeming to gather courage for what she wanted to say next. I've also been following news about the foundation you and Dad created. I've read about the families you've helped, the abuse cases you've exposed, the lives you've saved. You took the worst thing that ever happened to you and turned it into something that protects other people. That's exactly what Catherine would have done, and it's what she always hoped I would learn to do with my own pain. Victoria stood up as the visiting time neared its end. I don't expect you to trust me or forgive me, Emma. I certainly don't expect Dad to want any contact with me. But I wanted you to know that watching what you've built has taught me something important about what it means to be family. She looked at me one last time before the guard came to escort her back to her cell. Real family isn't about blood or legal documents or inheritance. It's about choosing to love someone unconditionally and fight for their well-being even when it costs you something. Catherine tried to teach me that, and I was too stubborn and angry to learn. You and Dad have shown me what I could have had if I had been brave enough to accept love instead of resenting it. The drive back to Riverside Manor gave me time to think about Victoria's revelations and what, if anything, I should share with Bob. The letter she had written remained unopened in my purse, but I could feel its weight like a physical presence. When I arrived home, Bob was in his study working on foundation business, reviewing applications from families requesting our help with suspected elder abuse cases. He looked up with the smile that had become my anchor through all the storms we had weathered together. "How was your mysterious errand?" he asked, setting aside the case files. "You were very secretive about where you were going today." I sat down across from his desk, the same desk where we had found the evidence that saved our lives, and told him about Victoria's call and our conversation. Bob listened without interruption, his expression cycling through surprise, pain, and something that might have been relief. "She's been writing to me," he said when I finished. "Letters that the Foundation's staff screens before I see my mail. I asked them to hold any correspondence from Victoria because I wasn't sure I was ready to deal with whatever she might say." Bob was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window toward Catherine's garden. "Catherine did worry about Victoria," he said finally. "She used to say that Victoria was punishing herself more than anyone else with her anger, that she was choosing isolation over love because love felt too risky after losing her first mother so young." I pulled Victoria's letter from my purse and placed it on the desk between us. "She asked me to give you this, but only if I thought you could handle reading it. She says she doesn't expect forgiveness, just wants you to know that she understands what she destroyed." Bob stared at the letter for several minutes before picking it up with trembling hands. "Emma, would you stay while I read this? I'm not sure I want to face whatever Victoria has to say alone." I moved to the chair beside his desk as Bob carefully opened the letter. His eyes moved slowly across the pages, and I watched his expression shift from wariness to sadness to something that looked like understanding. "She's in counseling," Bob said softly. "She's been diagnosed with attachment disorder related to childhood trauma. She says the therapist has helped her understand that her anger toward Catherine was really grief over her biological mother's death, that she never processed properly." Bob continued reading, occasionally sharing passages that revealed Victoria's growing insight into her destructive behavior. She wrote about watching news coverage of the Foundation's work and feeling proud of what Bob and I had accomplished together. She described her regret not just over the crimes she had committed, but over the decades of love and connection she had rejected out of fear. "She says she's proud to be my daughter," Bob said, his voice thick with emotion. "She says that seeing how you and I chose to be family has taught her what she missed by being too afraid to accept Catherine's love." When Bob finished reading, he set the letter down and sat quietly for several minutes. I waited, knowing that he needed time to process Victoria's words and decide how they affected his feelings about their relationship. "I think I'd like to write back to her," Bob said finally. "Not to absolve her of responsibility for what she did, but to let her know that understanding the reasons behind her actions helps heal some of the pain they caused." Over the following months, Bob and Victoria began a careful correspondence that focused on healing rather than forgiveness. Their letters dealt honestly with the damage that had been done, while also exploring the family wounds that had contributed to Victoria's destructive choices. Victoria shared insights from her therapy sessions about childhood trauma and attachment issues, helping Bob understand that her rejection of Catherine's love had been driven by fear rather than malice. Bob wrote about his own guilt over not recognizing Victoria's emotional struggles when she was younger, about his regret that he hadn't fought harder to bridge the gap between his daughter and his wife. The correspondence didn't erase the past or excuse Victoria's crimes, but it created a foundation for understanding that helped both of them process their complicated relationship. Bob found peace in knowing that Victoria finally understood what she had lost and was working to become someone different. Victoria found hope in Bob's willingness to maintain contact, despite everything that had happened. 6 months after my prison visit, Bob made a decision that surprised me. He announced that he wanted to visit Victoria in person, to have the conversation they should have had years earlier about love, loss, and the courage required to accept family bonds. "Are you sure that's wise?" I asked, concerned about the emotional toll such a visit might take on him. Bob smiled with the quiet confidence that had carried us through our darkest moments. "Emma, one of the things this whole experience taught me is that healing sometimes requires facing difficult truths. Victoria and I both made mistakes that contributed to our family's dysfunction. If she's brave enough to confront her failures, I should be brave enough to acknowledge mine." The prison visit was emotional but productive. Bob and Victoria talked honestly about Catherine's death, about Victoria's childhood struggles, and about the years of missed opportunities for connection. They didn't achieve complete reconciliation. The wounds were too deep and the crimes too serious. But they found a way to understand each other that created space for healing. Victoria would serve most of her sentence, and her relationship with Bob would never return to what it might have been if she had made different choices. But their correspondence continued, focused on growth and understanding rather than restoring the past. As I reflected on everything that had happened since Victoria's first phone call, I realized that her story had taught me something important about the nature of family and forgiveness. Some relationships can't be repaired, but they can be understood. Some hurts can't be undone, but they can be transformed into wisdom that prevents future pain. The foundation continued to grow, helping more families every month, while serving as a living memorial to Catherine's vision of protecting vulnerable people through love and dedication. Bob and I continued to build our chosen family, strengthened by the knowledge that we had survived the worst that greed and betrayal could inflict. And sometimes, in quiet moments in Catherine's garden, I thought about the complex web of love, loss, and redemption that had shaped all our lives. Victoria's attempt to destroy us had ultimately led to deeper understanding, stronger bonds, and a mission that protected countless others from similar exploitation. The estate that had nearly become our prison had become a sanctuary for healing and hope, proving that sometimes the greatest victories come not from avoiding pain, but from transforming it into something that serves a purpose greater than ourselves. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.